Scott. You're doing a great job. Just, I know you and I have talked about this, but it's remarkable how much the world doesn't understand about the coordinated community response and how just the idea of getting people in the same room and talking about it for an hour once a month is the strategy. And there's so much more to it. It's like people who don't understand what you'll talk about this afternoon when we talk about models is the the Duluth model of working with men is more than the power and control wheel. The coordinated community response is more than that meeting. So thank you for bringing that to us, and we'll have you go back into it, and we'll spotlight you and let you go.
Okay. It's you know, I got to say, it's a little discerning to see a huge picture of me in front of me. So I got a 50-inch TV and I'm trying to look at everybody else and not myself so I don't distract myself. But anyway, just to build off of what David said, how people have interpreted this as a meeting that you go to, just think about everything we just talked about, right? How far do you think you'd get in 12 one-hour meetings a year? Like, how many decades would it take you to get, a police policy written? Most of that work does not happen in a big meeting. In fact, you could jettison the big meeting and have all kinds of little small meetings that take place that are very specific to the agency that's doing the work, so that they never waste their time. They're always investing in something that's going to change their particular work. The other thing about the big meeting that we hear from practitioners all the time is, don't bring focus groups results, for example, on the police response to a meeting that has all my peers from other agencies sitting at the table, because we don't want to look like we're not doing our job, right? Don't embarrass us in front of everybody. So I need, as an organizer, I need transparency. I need people to tell me what their struggle is and what they see. And they're not going to do it in a big meeting because they're taking care of relationships that they need for other things, right? So those big meetings, you can have them, but the purpose of those should be very different than what we're talking about here. Because this stuff that we've been talking about won't happen in that space, and you don't have enough time for it. So yeah, it's a very different idea, to David's point. All right. So Teresa, are you running the slides? Jeff's going to try. Okay. So we switched. We got some feedback that our internet connection wasn't that great here. So we've switched to our backup system. So hopefully that improves delivery. So let us know. All right. Next slide, Jeff. So for those of you who may have just joined, just that we've been doing this work for over 4 decades. So we have a lot of experience on what does and does not work. I could do a whole workshop on what doesn't work from personal experience. Over the next 4 decades, this continuously evolving initiative became the most replicated way of responding to violence against women in the world. So this is really what Duluth kind of got put on the map for, is Ellen's genius in how to reform the way systems, again, medical systems, government systems, faith-based systems, whatever that is, how to reform system to respond better when survivors need help. Okay, next slide, Jeff. So let's just hit this question right off the top. Why work with government systems? Now, many of you might work in one, but there is a big debate nationally among domestic violence advocates that we should not be working with government systems, that they have failed us for too long, that there's no the time and energy we put into it, specifically the criminal justice system, has not garnered the results that we desire. So therefore we should walk away. Okay, I'm not part of that camp. Partly because I can see how things can change if you know how to do it. Most communities in the high 90 percentile, their way of trying to work with the system was those meetings that David was talking about. 12 meetings a year. And now they want to point the finger and say, you didn't change enough. Well, okay, that wasn't the format that was going to change it, right? So that's a big piece to it. If you go back to the slide. So survivors experience working in government systems. Typically, the answer I get in a focus group or individual interview with women is that when I called 911, it was a last resort. Why? Most of what he does to me, I don't call the police on. I just deal with it, right? But this time, and this is what I hear a lot, this time something was different. This time he was more drunk. This time he had something that was a weapon. This time he was saying something he's never said before. In other words, it boils down to the survivor's inability to predict how far this time it will go. And I need to call somebody for help. I don't want to, right? Because I don't want the consequences of dealing with him, right? For calling on him, but I don't have a choice. I'm standing with the phone in one hand and a knife in the other, and I'm just hoping that they get here before he gets to me, right? That's that moment when a lot of survivors are calling for help, right? Most abuse violence goes unreported, vast majority of it. So what are some reasons? Fear and consequence of the abuser. She knows he's not going away for life. In fact, she doesn't even know if he's going to be taken out of the house tonight, given the variety in ways in which communities respond to this problem, right? So if you have a way, our advocates can sit down in Duluth with a survivor in an advocacy agency and say, all right, so do you want to report what happened? I don't know. Okay, well, here's what would happen if you did. We would first call 911. They would dispatch a patrol officer. The patrol officer will show up here and they will ask you these questions, right? And the advocate knows what the questions are, right? Because they know the protocol. And now this survivor can make an informed decision if they want to participate, right? Now, on the flip side, if the survivor says to the advocate, I don't know if I want to report this, what will happen if I do? And they say, well, it depends on who we get. Nope, 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 not reporting, right? I need to know what's going to happen. I need to know where this is going to go. I need to know how it's going to happen. I am not going to make my situation worse by rolling the dice on it depends on who shows up, right? That's what you want to avoid. All right. Distrust of what the system will do or not do. Survivor history with responses that they deem unjust or unreliable. I called the police because he was beating me, and then I'm the one who gets arrested and he stays home, right? No, not going to call again. And then history of distrust due to government systems treatment of BIPOC and GLBTQ plus communities, right? There's a history there. So as there was a white officer I was talking to, and he said, you know, I get really frustrated walking into a home of an indigenous woman, and I'm trying to help. And she looks at me like I'm the enemy, right? Okay, well, here's the thing, right? There's a whole lot of history walking in that door with you. It isn't even about you at this point. It's about who you represent, right? So how do you overcome that in that space? And I'll give you an example. Body cams have really helped in some ways when you have access to them to see what actually happens at the scene. So you get this young officer walking into this home, right? And the place is just completely trashed. And he says, ma'am, I need you to sit on the couch for me, please. And I want you to answer some questions. I need to know what happened here. And she just starts walking around. But my house, I'm so embarrassed, and my doors and those mosquitoes are getting in, and he can't get her to sit on the couch and answer the questions. Right now, a more seasoned officer walks into the space and just basically says this, brushes him back and says, "Ma'am, where's your vacuum cleaner?" And she said, "It's in the closet." He gets out the vacuum cleaner. He undoes the cord. He starts vacuuming up the glass. Tells the other officer to sweep up the stuff in the kitchen. They both get the door put back on the hinges. And the more the space gets organized, the more her she becomes more level. And by the time they get done cleaning up the space, she's sitting on the couch. The experienced officer sits next to her and says, "Now what happened tonight, ma'am?" And she just tells them, right? Because that's an officer that understands I need to meet her where she's at. I can't walk into somebody's home at a late night after they've just been beaten and expect her to meet me where I'm at. That isn't how it works, right? I need to meet her where she's at. And there's all kinds of ways that we can help officers, give them ways of improving their work experience by knowing how to interact, right? Now, I go to a different community and the focus group of women said, you get one chance in our community. What do you mean one chance? One chance to call the police. Why is that? Well, because the first time they come out, they say, I'm taking him into jail right now. But if I have to come back here, you're going next time if you don't get out of this, because I'm not wasting my time coming back here 10 times. So we get one shot at it, right? Okay, well, if that's the case, yeah, response is not going to be good. And you would never, ever know that unless you did focus groups with survivors, right? All right. And yet many survivors still call and end up in government. So here is ultimately the question of why work with government systems. Because survivors are caught, lots of them are caught in government systems because they have an intimate partner who is beating them. And if I told a White House, there was a White House a panel on doing this kind of work, right? And I said, I don't get to choose where survivors call, right? If they're calling 911 because they need help and they're not getting it, then I'm obligated to try and reform the way that they respond. If they're caught up in CPS because he's beating her up and she's risking losing her kids, I'm obligated to work with that system to try and change what they do, right? If her pastor is alienating her from the church because they're prioritizing him over her, I'm obligated to do what I can to reform the way that they respond. If they're not getting the help that they need in a hospital, emergency room setting, I'm obligated to try and figure that out, right? So this is why we work with government systems, because if we get in a headspace that says, I'm not working with that system because they don't do what I want them to do, then basically when I turn my back, there's all these women I'm turning my back on also. And I don't think as advocates, that's what we should be doing, right? So that's the reason to work with government systems, not because they always do have the best interventions. It's because they don't, because they need the help of people whose job it is to know this space and partner with us and partner with them to figure out how do we do this better so that when she calls, she gets what actually she needs, right? Okay. Next slide. They are, okay. They are, okay. Teresa, yeah, thank you. Oh, David's doing it. All right. All right, so government agencies, this is just some of the things that can make it difficult to work with a government agency. They tend to work in silos, right? So my agency, my policies, my work product, that's it, right? So I go into a community and I say to law enforcement, so how do prosecutors take your work product into the system? I mean, are you satisfied with what they're doing with it? And you get this, well, there was a time, when we used to prosecute cases in our community, but we don't do that anymore, right? And then I go to the prosecutor and I say, so how's the work product that you're getting from the investigation to do your job? And they get the same thing. Well, there used to be a time in our community when we investigated crime, but I guess we don't do that anymore, right? So they will go their entire career criticizing another agency and nothing will change, right? So this is where somebody like myself steps in, right? I'm the liaison between these two agencies. Those two agencies may never actually meet face to face and radically change what they do, right? Because I'm meeting with law enforcement and saying, on every crime, there are things that have to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. There are elements to the crime. Everyone has to be proved beyond a reasonable doubt. But when you do the investigations like this, you're not collecting two of those elements. So we need to change the questions. We need to add things that you're collecting so that when you give it to them, they can actually do something with it. And here's the other thing. Your burden of proof at law enforcement is probable cause. That's the lowest burden of proof. But you give a probable cause investigation to a beyond a reasonable doubt standard in prosecution. Your report has to be investigated to beyond a reasonable doubt for them to be able to do anything with it. So you can't criticize them for not doing anything if you're not giving them what they need, right? But then as a prosecutor, you can't criticize them if they're not collecting what you need, but you're not telling them that you need it, right? You're just criticizing them for the fact that they're not giving it to you. So this is all the stuff that happens when people work in silos. And this is what you're trying to break down in a CCR, so that every person who touches this case does it in a way to make the next practitioner's job easier to do, right? Then you're linked as an agent, as a community. Tend to be cautious with community collaboration. They don't trust outsiders coming in, right? So that's going to have to be, that's a barrier that has to be broken down. Tend to make policy and protocols that improve the goals of government systems rather than the goals of those who try to access those systems. What a CCR does is actually flips that. We change it so that the policies and protocols that are changing make it easier for people to access what they do, rather than make it harder, which is typically how government ends up making policies and protocols. Can be over-reliant on worker discretion and less reliant on policy protocols and tools that direct specific actions in these cases, right? After we published, and we had our policy in Duluth for a number of years, all the officers knew it, all of them used it. I got a sit-down meeting with the deputy chief, and he said, our officers are asking if there's any way that we could put together a sexual assault investigative protocol like we have with the domestic assault. And I said, why is that? Well, they don't get a lot of these things. They don't do them every day, but they don't know what to do. They're really complex cases and there's no direction. And they said, if we had the kind of direction we have with domestic assault cases in a sexual assault case, that would really be helpful, right? So now here we're built a policy, right? That initially the officers like, I don't want this. Frontline officer, I don't want change. I just want to do what I do, right? But that changed, then now they're doing it. And now they're finding, wow, this is a lot easier because now when I go to the scene, I know exactly what I'm supposed to produce. I go to a sexual assault, it's kind of up to me and I don't know all the things I'm supposed to collect. I need help, right? So we built one of those with the Sexual Assault Agency in Duluth so that they have now a sexual assault protocol partnered with their command in developing it. Don't know much about how community agencies operate or why we operate. It's not their gig, right? So they don't know who we are or what we do or why we do it. And then the trust issues with outside agencies. Typically because when you feel powerless, which many people in a community-based agency feel up against government systems, when you feel powerless, the thing that you think you can do is point a finger and judge openly, right? But that actually doesn't change anything because they'll continue to do what they do. All it does is alienate you from that system and alienate you from being a better advocate for the woman you're working with because now you don't have access to understand why and how they do what they do, which you could help her navigate if you knew it, right? So that's one of those things that happen in communities that I see time and again. Next slide, David. Domestic violence organizations. So this is us. We tend to work in silos. Got the Sexual Assault Agency, got the men's program over here, got the shelter program over here, and we tend not to talk to each other too much, right? And because dollars are so limited in our space, that any like constant conversation about collaboration makes me feel like I'm going to potentially lose money if I collaborate that I could get for myself, right? So there's this way that we end up in silos ourselves, right? We tend to be cautious with collaborations because we have trust issues. We have trust issues because what we do on behalf of survivors is try to make them safer. And it's a fragile, fragile thing, fragile work to do. And we don't want to do anything that jeopardizes our ability to do that. So we're cautious when we enter into collaborations. Separate the world into those who get it and those who don't. Basically, I mean, if I've heard anything from advocates over the years, well, they just don't get it. Like, but we do. So we're good. And there's the rest of the world that doesn't. And that's, again, not helpful, right? It's fascinating to me that you can have a problem in front of you. And one individual from a different agency can look at it, and somebody from a domestic violence agency can look at it, and we see two completely separate things happen, right? So my question is to the advocacy agencies, how do you create a lens so that no matter who else is looking at it, they see what you see, right? That's the work of trying to make the violence visible to people so that they can actually see what's happening. And typically you do that by helping them see through the lens of the survivor. If they can see through her lens, they'll probably see a fairly accurate portrait of what's going on. If they look at it through his lens, it's going to be distorted. They're not going to see it. They're underpaid, overworked, burnout runs high, right? So you get a lot of turnover, right? Which then you have difficulty with tenure, right? And experience. A lot of it walks out our doors because we can't retain. Are exposed to very little training on community organizing. It's a tragedy to me that advocacy agencies don't have the funding, which New Mexico now is considering, and I think this is fantastic, which is what sets them apart, of trying to come up with money specifically for organizing, right? It's like they send them, pennies to work with all these women who need shelter and advocacy and that kind of thing. And the need is more than the services it can provide. And then we're going to layer this thing on without any more resources. Then it's just a way not to have anything change, right? Little interest in how government agencies operate, right? However, they have much to say about how they don't work, right? We're experts on how the government doesn't work, but we're not experts on how they do work, right? Or why they do what they do. And then trust issues with outside agencies. So you can see a lot of the things for domestic violence agencies are similar to criminal justice agencies or government agencies in general, right? So we all have this way of fragmenting ourselves within a community. And the more fragmented your community is in its response, the easier it is for an abuser to continue to do what they're doing, which means it's less safe for the survivors in your community. Okay, next slide, David. So here's what we know. There is no government or community-based agency that can solve this problem on their own. That is, if I know anything in the world, I know that, right? So we have to collaborate on such a deeply entrenched, historical, social problem of violence in the home. Like, it is longer, far deeper, more complex than just this guy committed a domestic assault on a Wednesday in Duluth. As Ellen used to say, when a man hits a woman across the face because he wants her to submit, that slap is historical. And if we don't see the history behind that slap, if we don't help him see the history behind that slap, then we're not doing our work, right? When we're not seeing the problem. The more coordination, the better outcomes for survivors and the men who are abusing. They get better outcomes because they have the opportunity then to change their life. Advocates are better at what they do because they learn how government works. Advocates who know how government works and can liaison between the survivor and the government agency are invaluable advocates, right? because they understand what she's up against. They just don't sit and complain about how government agencies don't do what they think they should be doing. And then government workers, we've watched it. We've had a whole host of investigators go through our domestic violence response team, which we have advocates from all our agencies working on. Every single investigator who went into that job, skill level at interviewing survivors and talking to offenders, improved dramatically because they worked side by side with advocates from the community. Every single one would tell you, I'm better at what I do because I work with advocates, right? So everybody can benefit from these collaborations, and it's essential if we want to have an impact on these cases. There's just too many and too much history and complexity for any one agency to pull this off on their own. Okay, next slide, Jeff or David. I'll get this by the end of the slideshow. All right, as I mentioned in the first session, this is that slide, and I just want to briefly kind of take you through it. A problem gets identified. That could come from a government agency. It could come from advocates that are working on the front line. It could come from focus groups. It could come from a men's group. All these different ways that you learn what gaps there are in the community. But here's the thing. If an advocate, for example, comes to me and says, this is a problem that I had with a case where da, 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 da. Okay, have you seen this happen in other cases? I want to know, is it a systemic issue? In other words, is it happening over and over and again? Or is it just particular to this particular woman's circumstances, right? Because if it's systemic, now it's part of my job, right? To look at why is this happening to groups of women that are getting caught up in this particular space, as opposed to just one individual. All right, once we identify what the problem is, now we have to expand our understanding of it. Who needs to be involved for us to figure out what ultimately is the source of the problem? And once we discover what the source of the problem is, now we have the traction to figure out how to solve it, right? And that could take you months to get to what the source of the problem is. Oh, I see that little marker there, David. Thank you. That's cool. As we follow around. So once you identify the source, now you're on approach, involve decision makers with a proposal for change. I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but given the problem, right? Here's what a proposal is. So in one of the problems in 911 was we took 25 random 911 calls that were domestic. And we brought call takers, dispatchers, law enforcement, prosecution, advocates, system change advocates, all together in a room. And we listened to these 25 calls, random. And we started learning all kinds of things. One thing we learned is that it's policy in 911 at the time that a call taker cannot get off the call until the law enforcement has arrived on scene. But repeatedly, call takers were leaving the scene or leaving the call before law enforcement arrived. Law enforcement was saying, hey, that thing that's happening right there, that didn't get conveyed in the CAD notes to the officer. We need to know that before we get there for our own safety. Can we add that to the list? Prosecutors, hey, you know what? When the guy calls and he's the one that committed the abuse, don't ask to talk to her. Keep him talking. I can use that, right? So there's all kinds of things that everybody had, all kinds of ideas that everybody had to improve. And then we took all of those things, plus what the women had said that they wanted, and we built that into an idea for change. So next, if you want to move that little marker down there, working group meetings, develop solutions. Now we bring together the people, both from the agency that's involved and the community, to start drafting. What is this going to look like, right? We draft those initial proposal for change, and then we start checking to see, has anybody else done this? Like check with some TA providers. They might know that somebody else had a version of this. We don't want to recreate the wheel. If somebody's already figured something out, let's build on it, right? and then promote, get everybody on board to implement and provide training. Now, here's the thing. See where training ends up when we're doing stuff? It's way towards the end. It's not the beginning, because now the training is going to take up why we did it, what the new protocol, what the new policy is, why we did it, and what the outcomes we're hoping for are. And then what their responsibility is to execute it, right? That's what our training looks like. Not to change minds, but to understand response. And then implement, problem solve, refine, integrate, see what we need to tweak. So we had a question in Duluth that was being asked. The prosecutor said, we need a question asked that gets at whether or not the survivor had been using or drinking when they talked to the officer. Why? Because it makes it difficult for us in the courtroom when the defense can start making up things like she was intoxicated, her testimony should be thrown. Like, we don't have a way of pushing up against that. So if the officer asks, have you been using? And they say no, or they say I had 2 beers or whatever, now we have a way of making that testimony reliable because we have a way of pushing up against it. Here's what happened though in implementation. Officers went into the home. It's a white woman and a white officer, and asked, have you been drinking, ma'am? Most of those women just answer the question. But when that white officer walked into a home of an indigenous woman and said, have you been drinking? The reaction was, get out. If you don't want to talk to me, you just think everybody drinks, fine, go. I'm not talking to you, right? So we had to go back and reform the way that, where and how that question was asked to make sure that everybody had the opportunity to answer it, right? Because it landed different in different communities within our community, right? So again, those are the things that you learn at implementation. There's always going to be unintended consequences for stuff that you do. That's why you want to center survivors in the work to limit that as much as possible, right? Okay. Next slide, David. All right, so let's just spend some time on observations as a way to build rapport, trust, and discover gaps in a community's response. So we'll just cover that aspect of learning about something. So next slide. What is behind the matrix, right? It's typically not as interesting as Trinity and Neo that you're going to find, but there's a way that that system operates, right? And it operates the same every time you go to court. How is that? How does everybody, no matter who the players are, that walk into that space, do it the same way? What is informing them? Why do they say the same kind of stuff in the same kind of hearing? How does the judge know what to do? What's informing the judge, right? Do advocates have any role in this? Do survivors have a voice in this, right? What is the outcome they're looking for? Why is that, right? All that stuff happens. And when I ask people, like new advocates in our agency, to go, I want you to go to court, I want you to tell me what happened. This is exactly what Ellen did with me. Go to court and tell me what happened. I came back and I said, well, Bob did this and Sherry did this and Annie did this, and and she said, okay, she didn't see anything. What do you mean you didn't see anything? I just told you what I saw. And she said, no, you didn't see the system. You saw people. You didn't see the system. Now, and she knew I was going to do this, but she said, now I want you to go back and I want you to ignore the people and I want you to see the system behind them. I want you to see the matrix, right? Like, what is that thing? Okay, next slide. You know how long it took me to put that slide together? That took me yeah, it shouldn't have, but it did. All right, so learning to see systems as opposed to individuals. In organizing, it's always about the system. It's never about the individuals. The more you stay stuck on individual performance issues, all you will do is create distance, animosity, and really negate your ability to organize. Because it really isn't about them. The question is, if you've got low performers doing something at the scene that is problematic to survivors or advantageous to offenders, The question is, what is allowing them to do that? That's what I want to focus on, not what they actually did, but if they can do that, then what is allowing it? So right along, officers, they got a new policy for domestic assault. And they actually say this, well, this domestic wasn't that bad, so we're not going to put the new policy on this one. Well, how does that, I mean, is that discretion you have? Well, I mean, they wanted to do with all of them, but I mean, it involves a lot of paperwork and a lot of questions. So, I mean, if it's bad enough, then we'll put the policy in. But if it's okay, well, that's really helpful information for me to know, because there's not a problem with policy within this department. It's a problem with supervision. Officers on the front line are making decisions to go against policy, right? That's part of what's going on here, right? So now I know what the solution, where the source of the problem is. It's not a low performing person. It's that they're allowed to do that, right? So now we got to go back and build some supervision mechanisms in so that can take care of that particular issue. So what we're going to do is we're going to watch a mock sentencing hearing that I'm going to be the, you're going to notice that I'm the offender and it's a younger me, a heavier me, me that has more hair than I do now. Just I tell you this just because I don't want you to be distracted wondering if that's the same guy that you've been listening to this morning. It is. When you're watching, how does each practitioner know how to do that job in court? This is one of your questions that you ask as an observer. What patterns do you notice from one hearing to the next? If you watch 10 of these hearings and they all happen basically the way the one you're going to watch, why is that, right? Who has the most influence in this series of sentencing hearings, right? Who would you talk to first and why? And regardless of the players, probation, prosecution, judge, defense attorney, defendant, these hearings would play out the same. Why is that, right? Okay, next slide. Okay, Jeff, you ready? All right, Jeff's going to play a sentencing hearing and watch it through that lens I just gave you. What's the system, not the players?
Next matter is a sentencing hearing for Mr. James Peterson. Mr. Peterson is present with his attorney, Ms. Myers, and Ms. Wright, the probation officer, is also present, and as is Ms. Asmus, from the city attorney's office. Ms. Wright, have you completed your pre-sentence investigation of Mr. Peterson?
Yes, I have, Your Honor, and he was cooperative with the investigation. He admits that they were both drinking during this incident. He is taking responsibility for and admits the assault. He is willing also to do domestic abuse counseling at DAIP. He is a lifelong Duluth resident. He is employed at Woodland Lumber as a machinist, where he has worked for the past 9 years. He's also a Little League coach. They have 3 children in common. Based on the assault and his willingness to attend the domestic abuse program, my recommendation is that he receive 90 days at the St. Louis County Jail or the Northeast Regional Correction Center, that time be stayed for 1 year of supervised probation under the following terms and conditions, that he attend and successfully complete domestic abuse programming, that he have no same or similar incidences, that he receive the minimum mandatory $300 fine plus surcharges and fees totaling $385, that he complete an alcohol and drug assessment and follow all recommendations of that assessment. I spoke to Mrs. Peterson and she is okay with the recommendation.
All right. And at this time, is there anything you'd like to add, Ms. Asmus?
Your Honor, just that I've spoken with the victim very briefly as well, and we're in agreement, the state is in agreement with the recommendation. We'd ask the court to adopt it.
All right. Ms. Myers, is there something you'd like to say on behalf of Mr. Peterson?
Just that we are in agreement with the recommendation as well, Your Honor. Mr. Peterson has accepted full responsibility for his actions, and the recommendation seems reasonable and appropriate.
Thank you. Mr. Peterson, Is there anything you'd like to add?
No.
Have you had an opportunity to review the police report?
Yes.
Mr. Peterson, I'd like you to understand that the crime of fifth-degree assault is a very, very serious matter. And that the consequences for you, if you do not follow your probationary rules, will also bring great and severe consequences. And I want you to clearly understand that if you violate the rules of your probation, you will do the jail time. You understand that?
Yes.
All right, Mr. Peterson, it's the judgment and sentence of this court that you be sentenced to the St. Louis County Jail and or the Regional Correctional Center for a period of 90 days. That sentence will be stayed for a period of 1 year, and you will be placed on.
Okay. So that's an average hearing, right? Not supposed to be great, not supposed to be bad, just an average kind of hearing that you're watching in a courtroom. Now, if we had time in a different kind of space, we could, well, actually, can they unmute themselves, David?
Yes, they can.
Okay, so here's a question. What did you see? What did you see as far as the system is concerned that you have questions about? Like, why did that happen the way that it happened? Just looking for your impressions. Okay, Antonia.
The victim had nothing to say at all.
Yeah, no, right. And what work do you do, Antonia?
I work in Jersey City with a battery intervention program.
Okay, so you come from the domestic violence end, right? So that's something you're going to see when you're sitting in that space, right?
Well, I work with the men who batter, or the
Yeah,
people
but
who
still,
batter.
I mean,
Yes.
you're connected. Yeah, you're
Yes.
connected to
Yes.
that.
Yes. Very much.
So you're going to notice right away, like nobody's talking to the victim about that, right?
Yep.
Yep. What else? Let me ask you this. Who would you want, if you were going to find out what goes on in that room, who would you talk to first and why?
I just noted that no one talked about the impact to the children. If they have children, I mean, he's a coach in the community, and impact to children and what they experienced was not a part of the sentencing hearing.
Well, how did what he did as far as the crime get framed?
That he was drinking alcohol and she was drinking alcohol, and it was, the alcohol's fault and not his fault. So there's no accountability. I will just leave it there before I go on a.
Sarah, we are now organizers. We are going to cleanse ourselves of judgment. Right?
Scott?
Yes.
I noticed.
Hi, Paul.
Hi. I noticed that the crime was mentioned in legal terms, but the specific actions which constituted the crime had no place in the room.
So again, fascinating. How is it that you go in and give essentially a citizenship report on somebody who's committed an act of violence against their family, and that suffices to level a sentence against it? Like, I'm curious about that, right? Good. Joseph.
Yeah, it appeared that he was not remorseful in any way. He was very stoic, and it was just a matter of him sitting there thinking that, boy, I got away with this easy.
Yeah, and did you notice that when I walked in and I'm walking, I give her a look, right? And I have to be redirected by the agent. Nothing ever gets said about that. I got away with that. I intimidated her and I got away with it. Who would you talk to first about trying to break down what's happening in this room?
I think the judge was very lenient
How was the
in the
judge
way
lenient to you,
in
Joseph?
the way he approached it. You
So
know,
what do
he
you mean?
just, he listened to all the recommendations and just went with it. It didn't appear that he had any personal feelings as to what had transpired between the perpetrator and the victim. You know, he just did his job. You know, he just went along with whatever was being recommended. He didn't empathize at all as far as I was concerned.
Okay, Joseph, I want you to be you. I'm going to be that judge, right? And you ask me some questions about what you're thinking here. What would you want to know from the judge?
Your Honor, why didn't you ask the perpetrator to be more specific as to his commission of the assault? I mean, you know, you just allowed him to go yes, 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 and that really upset me because it seemed like you appeared disinterested.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, I'm gonna be a nice judge, Joe, and I'm not gonna get mad at you for your question. Calling me a disinterested judge, right? So here's the thing, Joe. This whole agreement was developed outside the courtroom, and they're giving it to me. And in some ways, I'm here to kind of rubber stamp it. Now, if I kick it back, I could do that. I could say I'm not accepting the plea. But if I do that, I send the city attorney's office into a tailspin because now they got to go back and renegotiate everything. And it just creates all kinds of chaos. So what you saw as disinterest is really me not having much power in that space. The real power is ending up in probation and prosecution with defense coming up with agreement they all have agreed on. Who am I to start kicking it in saying it's not good enough? Right? So right there, you learn something about who does what and why, right? We think judges, they run the courtroom, but they don't run pleas, right? That's defense, probation, and prosecution, right? So again, that's the kind of stuff that you learn. Let's go to Barbara and then we'll go to Andrea.
I really would like to hear from the victim because we didn't.
Okay. And what would you ask the victim?
I would ask the victim for her input and whether or not she was okay with what was happening, whether or not she felt like she was safe, and yeah, just about what was going on in that courtroom, because we don't know that view, I guess.
Okay, so I've had those conversations. This is what you get when you ask it specifically like Barbara was asking it. Did you, or were you okay with what the agreement was? Well, if I tell you, but you're not going to tell anybody, right? Because I don't want any part of this, right? Right? I don't want to be my name. I don't want my name on anything that has to do with what's going to happen to him, right? So, but on Barbara's track of thinking, I'd want to know, what's this whole process been like for you? The prosecutor said she had a brief conversation with you. Was that the first time you talked to her? Was today? Right? Like, that's information. Who did most of the talking to you? What did you say to them? How did they say they were going to use the information that you gave them? Did you feel protected in the process? Did you feel like you had allies in the system? Right? Would you do this again? If he harmed you, would you call 911 again? Why or why not? Like, those are, I want to know like the whole thing for that survivor.
Right. Well, I would have liked to have heard that victim impact statement read. You know, does the judge have that? Was the judge informed about how this impacted? Because even if there is a plea agreement, the judge is still the one that decides whether to follow that or not.
Okay,
I
so
mean,
let me just give you an answer back, Barbara, right? So I'm the judge, and I'm going to tell you, well, this is a misdemeanor domestic assault. It's a maximum of 90 days and a $1,500 fine. We already got it. Like that impact statement's not going to change anything, right? So it's not going to enhance it. It's not going to make it worse. It's not going to make it more accountable. I'm not going to do anything that's going to change what the outcome of this hearing is. So why should I spend the time on that if the victim doesn't want to do it, right? Like why am I doing that, Barbara?
what makes you think that the victim doesn't want to do it? Have you asked for it?
Well, yeah.
Has it
okay,
been provided to you?
right. So has the victim been requested to do one? If they said yes, it would have been read, right? But in this case, it was no. In this particular jurisdiction, it would have been read. But in this case, she didn't want to do it. But now you're asking in general, are they helpful to me as a judge? And I'm going to say, no, it's just more time. I got 10 more cases to do, right? And he got the worst he can get. So what are we doing, right? That kind of
Yeah.
thing. That's a response you get, right?
Right.
So I gotta at least consider that, right? So if I think it's important to read that in the room, who is it being read for? Judge has taken himself off the list. Then is there a way to make him feel differently about what he's done by reading and being, in a sense, forced to listen to her voice that he's never had to listen to before? That might be an argument that you could make to the system to say that's why it's important for his accountability in that space, to give her the voice in their relationship for the first, maybe for the very first time, right?
Excuse me, Scott,
Because go ahead, David.
you have just under 5 minutes and 2 or 3 more hands still.
Sorry, thank you, David. Yes, let's go to Andrea.
Yes, sir. I will keep mine quick, but I just want to actually, so I've been in quite a few courtrooms. I work with a batterers intervention program in the state of Indiana. Victim impact statements aren't always required. Not every state requires them. So unfortunately, the victims are not always heard. And there's also that presumption of victim safety. So if the victim and the perpetrator are in the same courtroom, the victim may not feel safe to implicate themselves in that situation or throw out their emotions and their feelings of, please forgive, the bullshit that they just dealt with.
Right.
They're willing to take whatever they can get to hold this person accountable for the things that they have endured. And I don't want to minimize victims, because I want to really maximize their feelings that, you know, they've had a crappy road in some of this. And go ahead, sir.
So then if that's so taking exactly your line of thinking, Andrea, that's why you sit down with groups of women in focus groups and say, all right, we have this thing in the state that allows an option for an impact statement. Under what conditions would you feel comfortable giving one? Under what conditions wouldn't you? Right? Because they've all been in that space before, so they know what it is. So now you're going to learn a lot from the victim's perspective about their thinking about how you want them handled. And to your point, a lot of them are going to say, don't put me in the space. This is the state's case against them. Don't make it my case against them, right? Because I got to deal with him when he gets out, because he's getting out, right?
Exactly. And that's where sometimes we really want to push, you know, all the stuff that's happened to the survivor. But unfortunately, We don't know what home life looks like. We don't know if once they leave court, they have to go to the same home with the children, and we don't know what happens behind closed doors, because yeah, she was brave this time. Please forgive,
Yeah.
but I'm going to throw out that nasty thinking of what if the next time is the last time?
Yeah, so she's always weighing the consequence of any action she takes that is detrimental to him, or at least even perceives it as detrimental to him. She's always got to have that lens up. So Julie.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that the lawyer's statement that he admitted that they had both been drinking, I really felt like that was a re-victimization, and I felt like the judge should have addressed that, because whether or not she had been drinking was irrelevant. And it was kind of like your glare at her or the glare as you walk by, it's the same sort of thing. He should not be able to admit that they both were drinking. It's like, no, it should have been, he admits that he had been drinking. I think would have been more appropriate. I think the judge should have addressed it and said,
yeah, judges aren't going to do that in that space, right? So that's going to be your work, Julie, saying to the probation officer. So when you made the statement, they've both been drinking. How do you think about domestic violence, and how did saying that they both were drinking make sense to you in a sentencing hearing for him, right? And they're going to give you that. So don't go in with an answer, right? As an organizer, go in with a question. You want to know what their thinking is, right? There was a probation agent who said, what are we going to do with all these women who keep finding men to beat them? Okay, now that can be inflammatory, right? But I need to know something in his work experience says that's an answer to what I see. Remember that thing? We both look at the same thing and we both see something completely different. What lens is he looking through where that kind of a statement makes sense? If I don't create a space safe enough for him to say it, I'll never know what it is. And I can't find a way to fix it, right? So got to take that judgment, throw it out the door, right? As an organizer, and you're curious. You're making inquiry. David, I'm killing you, I know, because we've run out of time. So I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Okay, got to blame somebody, right? So everyone, we are on a 15-minute break now. When we come back, we'll be in a new room, and Scott will be joined by Margaret and Stacy, both from Oklahoma and Georgia, doing CCR work there, sharing their experience. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions, but I know Scott would be happy to correspond if there are other conversations that you'd like to have.
Yeah, you can get me on executive director on our website, theduluthmodel.org. So if you want to send me an email or put something in the chat for the next session or something.
Thank you, Scott.
David.